On a warm Monday evening in June 2007, 9 men walked into a furniture store in Charleston, South Carolina, and never came out. They were not victims of a crime. They were not caught in a natural disaster. They were firefighters, professionals trained and trusted to face the worst. And yet, within 34 minutes of the first alarm, all 9 of them were dead, buried under a collapsed roof, in the most devastating loss of firefighter lives the United States had seen since the morning the Twin Towers fell. What happened inside that building that night is a story of fire, of courage, and of a series of invisible failures that had been quietly stacking up for years, waiting for one ordinary evening to bring them all crashing down at once. To understand what happened on the night of June 18th, you have to understand the building. Because the Sofa Superstore on Savannah Highway was not simply a furniture store. It was, in many ways, a building that should not have existed in the form it did, a structure that had been quietly transformed over decades into something far more dangerous than anything its original blueprints ever imagined. Savannah Highway is the main artery feeding through West Ashley, the sprawling suburban side of Charleston that sits just across the Ashley River from the Old City. It is a wide, busy commercial corridor lined with car dealerships, strip malls, and franchise restaurants, the kind of American road that exists in every mid-sized city. The Sofa Superstore sat at number 1807, a large single-story building that looked, from the road, like one solid structure. It was not. It was 3 separate buildings that had, over time, been joined together into a single interconnected maze, and almost none of that joining had been done with the city's knowledge. The core of the building had started life in the 1950s as a grocery store. It was a type of construction common to that era: concrete block walls, a roof made of lightweight steel bar joist trusses covered with foam insulation, and a rubber membrane. That original structure measured roughly 125 feet wide by 130 feet deep. Over the following decades, it changed hands and changed purposes, and in 1992, the Sofa Superstore moved in and began selling furniture for what was essentially a converted supermarket shell. The business grew. In 1994 and 1995, 2 pre-engineered lightweight steel showroom additions were attached to either side of the original building, one to the east and one to the west, each measuring 60 feet wide by 120 feet deep. These additions were permitted and recorded. But then something shifted. From the late 1990s onward, for more additions were constructed on the property, a loading dock area connecting the showroom to a large warehouse at the rear, along with modifications to interior spaces. None of them had permits. None of them were inspected. The city of Charleston did not know they existed. In fact, city officials only discovered the extent of the unpermitted construction after the fire, when someone thought to look at aerial photographs. What those unpermitted additions had done, invisibly and incrementally, was eliminate every meaningful fire barrier between the 3 connected buildings. There are no firewalls separating the east showroom, the main showroom, and the west showroom. There was no physical separation between the showroom and the warehouse. 6 roll-down fire doors have been installed in the openings between the showrooms, each fitted with a fusible link designed to automatically close the door when heat reached a certain level. 3 of the doors on the west side were non-functional. They had never been replaced or repaired. Regular fire inspections of the building had been discontinued in 1999 and never resumed. From the front, standing on Savannah Highway, none of this was visible. The building had a tall, decorative facade, a parapet wall that rose above the actual roofline, which gave it the appearance of a single modern commercial structure. The parapet was not just cosmetic. It also obscured the roofline from anyone trying to assess the building from the outside, making it harder to gauge the true height and construction of the roof from the street. The building looked solid. It looked unified. It looked safe. It was none of those things. And then there was the loading dock. Tucked between the back of the main showroom and the front of the warehouse, the enclosed loading dock had become a multi-purpose space. It was used to stage furniture for the next day's deliveries, so it was typically packed with sofas, chairs, and upholstered pieces waiting to be loaded onto trucks. It was also, informally, the place where employees came to take their smoking breaks. Combustible materials in an enclosed space next to an area where people routinely lit cigarettes. A small pile of trash had accumulated there, as it tends to do in working docks. No one thought much of it. The entire complex, when you added it all together, covered nearly 60,000 square feet of interconnected retail and storage space. Floor to ceiling, every room was filled with upholstered sofas, armchairs, recliners, and dining sets. Tens of thousands of individual pieces of furniture constructed largely from synthetic foam and treated fabrics. Not a single square foot of it was protected by an automatic sprinkler system. What the city of Charleston was left with, without knowing it, was one of the most combustible retail environments in the country, disguised behind a showroom facade on one of its busiest suburban roads. The store was still open when the fire began. Employees were moving furniture, helping customers, going about the ordinary rhythms of a Monday evening. Sometime around 7 o'clock, a small fire started in the trash that had accumulated in and around the covered loading dock at the rear of the building. It was at that moment an unimpressive thing. A smoldering pile of rubbish, tucked behind a furniture store, not yet visible from the road. An employee spotted it first and tried to knock it down with a hand extinguisher. He could not. At 7 minutes past 7, a passerby driving along the street behind the property looked over and saw smoke rising from the rear of the building and called 911. The call went out, smoke showing from the rear of the Sofa Superstore on Savannah Highway. The initial response brought Engine 11, Engine 10, Ladder 5, and Battalion 4. The assistant fire chief happened to be having dinner at Engine 11 Station House at the time and rode with them. Engine 11 was directed to Pebble Road, the residential street that ran behind the store, because the fire was described as being at the rear of the building. When the crew arrived on Pebble Road, they found that the property was fenced in from that side, and they could not access it. They had to reposition. It was a small delay, the kind of thing that happens in the first confusing minutes of any call, but it cost time. Meanwhile, Engine 10, which happened to be nearby picking up groceries for the station, arrived faster than usual and approached from Savannah Highway, coming around the building to access the loading dock area from the rear of the showroom. What the firefighters found when they reached the loading dock was a fire that had already moved from the trash pile and into the enclosed dock itself, feeding on the stage furniture and the combustible materials stored there. The assistant chief walked through the front doors of the main showroom to assess conditions inside. What he found was almost nothing. Light visibility, very faint wisps of smoke near the back of the ceiling. The main showroom, with its thousands of square feet of upholstered furniture and wooden pieces, appeared calm. A firefighter walking through that space would have had no obvious reason to believe that above the drop ceiling, in the hidden void between the suspended tiles and the actual steel roof, a slow and silent accumulation of heat, smoke, and toxic gases was already building. A door at the rear of the right showroom addition was opened, and through it the assistant chief could see fire. That was the moment the operational scale of the incident changed. Crews were advancing hose lines toward the loading dock from outside the warehouse, while inside the showroom other crews began searching and trying to prevent the fire from crossing into the retail space. The supply of water in those first minutes was limited to what the engines carried in their tanks, because it took time to connect to the municipal hydrant system. For 9 minutes at the loading dock and 15 minutes at the front of the store, firefighters were fighting a growing fire with the water they had brought with them. At 19 minutes past 7, a trapped employee called 911 from inside the building. He was somewhere at the rear of the showroom, unable to find his way out. The fire department now had a rescue mission running simultaneously with an active interior attack. More companies were called in. Firefighters from the St. Andrews Public Service District arrived as a mutual aid response. The scene was expanding quickly, but it was expanding without a spine. The fire chief had arrived and was directing crews, but no formal command structure had been established, no designated post, no single point of authority that could see the whole picture and make decisions for the whole operation. On a scene that was about to change faster than anyone expected, that absence was going to matter enormously. For a few minutes, the situation inside the showroom felt manageable. Crews moving through the aisles of furniture could still see. The haze near the ceiling was thickening, but the floor level, where firefighters worked, remained relatively clear. There was a belief, reasonable at the time, that the fire could be stopped at the loading dock before it crossed fully into the retail floor. That belief was about to be violently corrected. Above the drop ceiling of the main showroom, invisible to everyone below, the void space had become a reservoir of superheated gases and unburned combustion products. Modern upholstered furniture, particularly pieces constructed with polyurethane foam, does not burn like wood. It releases enormous quantities of dense, toxic, and highly flammable smoke at temperatures far exceeding what older, natural fiber furniture would have produced. The sofas and chairs filling that showroom were essentially gigantic blocks of fuel generating a gas layer that was waiting under enormous thermal pressure for one thing: oxygen. 24 minutes into the incident, a decision was made to break the front showroom windows. The intention was to improve visibility and aid the search for the trapped employee. It was a standard firefighting technique used in countless fires without consequence. But in this building on this night, it was the action that broke everything open. The moment those windows shattered, a rush of fresh air poured into the showroom. It hit the fire. It fed the gas layer above the ceiling. What happened next took seconds. At 7:41 in the evening, 34 minutes after the first alarm, the main showroom of the sofa superstore flashed over. A flashover is not an explosion in the conventional sense. It is the moment when every combustible surface in a space ignites simultaneously, when the accumulated heat reaches a point of no return and the room itself becomes the fire. The temperature in the showroom went from survivable to lethal in a matter of seconds. The fire swept from the rear of the building to the front, then poured through the non-functional fire doors into the east and west showrooms at a speed that no one inside could outrun. At least 16 firefighters were working inside the building when the flashover occurred. Some made it out. Some were close enough to exits to feel the heat surge and throw themselves through doorways and windows. But 9 of them were not. 6 firefighters were caught in the main showroom. 3 were in the west showroom when the fire doors between the spaces failed to contain the fire. Mayday calls began coming over the radio, firefighters transmitting that they were in trouble, that they were disoriented, that they were running out of air. The thermal imaging cameras that were on scene and could have helped locate trapped firefighters in zero visibility conditions had not been deployed during the size-up or the interior attack. The lightweight steel bar joist trusses that formed the roof of the main showroom, the same construction common to countless commercial buildings across America, began to fail. Steel that appears solid and permanent at room temperature loses half its load-bearing strength at temperatures that a structure fire routinely reaches. The trusses bent. The roof collapsed, burying the firefighters still inside under tons of steel, debris, and the burning remnants of a showroom they had been trying to protect. Rescue crews pushed through the open window frames, trying to reach their brothers inside, but the collapse had sealed the building against them. By the time the fire was brought under control, the names were already being confirmed. Captain Lewis Mulkey, who was also an assistant basketball coach at Somerville High School, and who his mother later described as someone who never seemed to stop moving between the fire department, the school, and everything in between. Captain Mike Benke, whose son Hunter would grow up to become a Charleston firefighter himself, following his father into the same station house. Captain Billy Hutchinson, 30 years in the department, 48 years old. Engineer Brad Beatty. Engineer Mark Kelsey. Assistant Engineer Michael French, a firefighter his friends said had 2 passions, the fire department and his daughter. Firefighter Melvin Champagne. Firefighter Earl Drayton, whose daughter Jeanette came to the memorial outside the store the very next morning. Firefighter Brandon Thompson, 27 years old, the youngest of the 9. All of them gone in the same 34 minutes. The morning of June 19th arrived gray and hot over Charleston. Firefighters who had been at the scene all night stood outside the ruin of the Sofa Superstore in exhaustion and grief. One by one, over the course of that day, the bodies of the 9 men were carried out of the building by their fellow firefighters. The mayor of Charleston, Joe Riley, addressed the city the night before with words that trembled with the weight of what had happened. A procession of 150 fire trucks from departments across the country gathered for the memorial service held on the following Friday at the North Charleston Coliseum. More than 3,000 fire service representatives attended, including the New York City Fire Department's Emerald City Pipe and Drum Corps, who led the procession through streets lined with people standing in silence. But even as the city mourned, the questions were already forming. 3 separate investigations were launched almost immediately. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which investigates every firefighter line of duty death in the country, dispatched investigators to Charleston the morning after the fire. The National Institute of Standards and Technology sent its own team to gather data and reconstruct the fire through computer simulation. And the city of Charleston commissioned an independent post-incident review by a panel of National Fire Service experts led by Gordon Routley, which would become one of the most comprehensive analyses of a single fire incident ever conducted. There was, however, a problem. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which had jurisdiction over the scene as a potential criminal investigation, had ordered the removal of the building's sheet metal roof before the NIOSH and NIST investigators could fully access the structure. Key physical evidence about the construction and behavior of the roof was gone before the fire scientists could study it. The investigators had to rely on photographs, post-fire residue, dimensional measurements, and visits to other stores in the Sofa Superstore chain to reconstruct what the building had looked like before it burned. Then, on the 2nd of July, 2 weeks after the fire, Fire Chief Rusty Thomas told federal investigators that his department would not allow them to interview the firefighters who had been on scene. The stated reason was to protect firefighters who were still grieving from having to relive the experience. The head of NIOSH wrote directly to the chief, asking him to reconsider. It was not until the city's mayor personally called the federal agency 4 days later that access was granted, and the city quickly described the entire episode as a misunderstanding. Whether it was a misunderstanding or an instinct toward institutional self-protection, it cast a shadow over the early days of the investigation that would not quickly lift. When the reports finally came, they were unsparing. The city-funded review concluded that the fire could have been prevented, full stop, if the building had been constructed and maintained according to existing state and local codes. The fire would have been quickly controlled and no lives would have been lost. The report identified that combustible materials had been improperly stored in an area where employees smoked, that the enclosed loading dock had been built without permits, that exit doors had been locked and pathways obstructed, and that the 4 unpermitted additions had systematically eliminated the fire separation between all 3 of the building's connected sections. The NIOSH report was equally direct in its assessment of the fire department itself. Its conclusion was one of the most significant and carefully worded judgments in the history of American firefighter fatality investigations. It stated that the final analysis did not suggest that any of the firefighters who lost their lives, or any of the surviving members of the Charleston Fire Department, had failed to perform their duties as they had been trained or as expected by their organization. The analysis indicated that the Charleston Fire Department had failed to adequately prepare its members for the situation they encountered. The men did not fail. The institution failed the men. What the investigations uncovered, piece by piece, was a department operating without the infrastructure that modern firefighting demands. No one on the scene had been designated to track which crews were inside the building, which units they belonged to, or how much air remained in their breathing apparatus. There was no safety officer. There were no pre-incident plans for large commercial structures like the Sofa Superstore, no documents that would have told arriving companies about the building's hidden construction, its interconnected voids, or the non-functional fire doors between its showrooms. Latter companies had been staffed with as few as 2 members. The culture of the department was one of aggressive interior attack, a culture built on courage and tradition, but one that had not been paired with the formal risk assessment tools to know when a building had already passed the point where interior attack was survivable. The owner of the Sofa Superstore, Herr Goldstein, was never criminally charged. The city found itself unable to pursue the building code violations through its normal channels either, because the buildings no longer existed and there was nothing left to bring into compliance. What Goldstein did do was establish the Charleston Nine Scholarship Endowment with an initial donation of $100,000, a fund designed to help pay college tuition for the children of first responders, including those who had lost a parent in the line of duty. The city purchased the 2-acre site on Savannah Highway for $1.85 million to preserve it as a permanent memorial. Fire Chief Rusty Thomas, who had led the department through the most catastrophic night in its history and through the investigations that followed, retired in the summer of 2008. The fire at the Sofa Superstore did not end on the night of June 18, 2007. In a very real sense, it is still burning in the training academies and fire stations and code committees where its lessons are taught, debated, and slowly, imperfectly turned into change. To understand why 9 professional firefighters died in a furniture store in 34 minutes, you have to follow the failure back to its roots, because the failure did not begin that evening. It had been growing for years in the materials used to build sofas, in the construction methods used to build commercial spaces, in the culture of a fire department, and in the legal language that decided which buildings needed sprinklers and which ones did not. Start with the furniture. The sofas and chairs that filled that showroom were not like the furniture of a generation earlier. Modern upholstered furniture is constructed primarily with polyurethane foam, a petroleum-based synthetic material that burns with a ferocity that natural fiber alternatives cannot match. Polyurethane foam reaches its peak heat release rate within 2 to 3 minutes of ignition. It produces thick, black, toxic smoke at volumes that can fill a large room to zero visibility in less than 5 minutes. It generates carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide in concentrations that are lethal far faster than simple heat or lack of oxygen. The furniture filling a modern retail showroom is, from a fire behavior perspective, one of the most dangerous environments a firefighter can enter, and the fire codes governing those environments had not kept pace with how dramatically the materials had changed since the 1970s. Then there is the construction. The lightweight steel bar joist trusses that form the roof of a Sofa Superstore are among the most common structural elements in American commercial construction. They are inexpensive, efficient, and perfectly adequate in almost every situation they will ever encounter. Fire is the exception. Unlike solid wood or heavy timber, which chars slowly and retains structural integrity for a significant period even while burning, lightweight steel fails abruptly. It does not warn you. It does not sag gradually. When steel trusses reach critical temperature, they can fail within minutes, and they take the roof with them in a sudden, complete collapse. Firefighters operating beneath a lightweight steel roof during an advanced fire are working with a clock they cannot see. And in 2007, no formal training requirement in Charleston existed to make sure they understood that. And then there is the question of sprinklers, which is perhaps the single clearest lesson the Sofa Superstore fire left behind. The National Institute of Standards and Technology built a detailed computer simulation of the fire, reconstructed from measurements, photographs, construction records, and radio transmissions collected in the days and months following the disaster. Their model showed that a single automatic sprinkler installed in the loading dock, positioned at the point where the fire first grew beyond the initial trash pile, would have activated within the first minutes of the fire's development. It would have reduced the heat output dramatically, slowed the spread of fire into the dock, and in all likelihood contained the fire entirely to the area where it started. The 9 firefighters would not have died. The building might not even have been significantly damaged. One sprinkler. That is not hyperbole. That is what the federal simulation showed, and the finding became one of the central points of the NIST report, which went on to make 11 recommendations for improving fire safety nationally. Among them, automatic sprinklers should be required for all new retail furniture stores, regardless of their size, and should be retrofitted in existing stores with any single display area larger than 2,000 square feet. The report called on state and local governments to adopt and strictly enforce existing national model building codes, and specifically recommended that occupancy classifications be reformed to properly account for what a furniture showroom actually represents in terms of fire risk. The reason the Sofa Superstore had no sprinklers traces back to a combination of outdated code language and the invisibility of its unpermitted additions. The occupancy classification for mercantile buildings, like a furniture store, did not automatically trigger a sprinkler requirement below certain size thresholds. The building's original permitted structure had been small enough to fall within that exemption. But the 4 unpermitted additions had dramatically expanded the building's total connected floor area and eliminated every fire separation that would have contained a fire within a single section. A building that had quietly grown far beyond what its permits described continued to be treated, for code enforcement purposes, as if those additions had never happened because no one in the city knew they had. It was a legal fiction maintained entirely by ignorance, and 9 men paid for it. Within the Charleston Fire Department itself, the changes that followed the fire were sweeping and immediate, and they continued for years afterward. An incident command system was formalized and made mandatory at every fire scene, ensuring that one person always had documented, communicated authority and responsibility over all operations. An accountability system was instituted to track every firefighter's location and air supply status during interior operations. Pre-incident planning for large commercial structures became a departmental standard, meaning that crews arriving at a building like the Sofa Superstore would have access to floor plans, construction details, and known hazards before they ever stepped inside. Minimum crew sizes were raised. Written standard operating procedures were developed, implemented, and enforced. Training was redesigned to include explicit instruction on the hazards of lightweight construction and the behaviors of modern synthetic materials in fire. The department, as one of its own assistant chiefs later put it, had its DNA changed. The Gordon Routley panel's independent review was deliberately made public and distributed as widely as possible because the investigators understood that what they had found in Charleston was not an isolated failure. It was a mirror. Departments across America were operating with similar gaps in command structure, similar deficiencies in training, similar building stock of lightweight construction filled with synthetic materials and no sprinklers. The report from Charleston became required reading in fire academies across the United States and was studied internationally. It is taught not as a story of individual error, but as a case study in how systems fail and how the quiet accumulation of small oversights can combine, under the right conditions, into a catastrophe that no single person intended and no single decision caused. The site at 1807 Savannah Highway was cleared. The ruins were removed. The city planted grass and laid down brick pathways. 9 permanent markers now stand in a field at the exact positions where the building's footprint once lay, each one marking the spot where one of the 9 men fell. Brick pillars trace the perimeter of what was once the showroom wall. There are engraved bricks set into the ground with messages from the community, from families, from firefighters who came from other cities and other states to pay their respects. A new fire station, Station 11, was built adjacent to the Memorial Park along Savannah Highway so that the men and women of the department who work that district do so in the shadow of what was lost and in full awareness of what it cost. Every year on June 18th, the Charleston Fire Department